will go to, a recording will go to everybody who's registered. And if you're just coming in, feel free to put your name, where you're from in the chat, and just like a run of the show. First of all, welcome to this wonderful program on nuclear abolition, a scenario. And just,
I was muted. Right.
like
So
the show. First of all, welcome to this wonderful program on nuclear abolition, a scenario. Right, we've got lots in store. Put your name, where you're coming from, where you live in chat, and so the show. First of all, welcome to this wonderful program on nuclear abolition, a scenario.
Mary Ellen, we're hearing feedback from the live stream. If you could please mute.
I got it.
Thank you.
Lovely, lovely. Okay, so we will start our program in just a minute or so. After a presentation by our speaker, we're going to have lots of time for questions. Tonight, we're going to please put your questions into chat. And we're going to do it that way rather than raising your hand. So put your question into chat, put information in chat, keep a lookout because there's a lot that's going to be put in there, a lot of good information that we will all want to know. So this is a program sponsored by MAPPA's Nuclear Disarmament Working Group and by Warheads to Windmills. You're going to hear a lot about Warheads to Windmills and what they are up to. Just to say for a minute, I just heard speeches on nuclear weapons by the members of Congress, and it was hosted by Representative Jim McGovern. And at the end of his speech, he said, given what is happening, given the 80th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, this is the moment to do what we can. This is the time to step up and address the dangers of nuclear weapons. So with that in mind, we are so lucky to have Timmon Wallis here tonight to talk about what we can do. We are not without agency, and Timmon is here to give us some thoughts. Timmon Wallis lives in Northampton, and he's the current director of nuclearban.us, and he coordinates the Warhead to Windmills Coalition. Timmon.
Okay, well, thank you, Susan, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm going to talk about my new book, which is called Nuclear Abolition, a Scenario. I don't know if that comes out backwards or not, but anyway. I'll say a little bit about it and my goals for writing it and why I wrote it. But I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because there's a lot, and that's why it's a whole book. So I'm hoping you'll read it if you haven't already. But before I talk about my book, I want to talk about another book. So I'm going to share a screen again and share some slides. This other book, which I hope at least some of you have read, and if not, I urge you all to read it. It's a very easy read. It's not an easy read in terms of the content, but it's an excellently written book. And it starts out with the launch of a single nuclear weapon and ends up 72 minutes later with the end of human civilization as we know it. And Annie Jacobsen, who wrote the book, says very clearly that this is insane, what we've got with our nuclear weapons and the whole system that's set up to use them if it comes to that. And she had her book reviewed in the New York Times. It was a bestseller on the New York Times bestseller list. And the reviewer asks, well, if the only alternative is the abolition of nuclear weapons, how do we get from here to there? And that,
Timmon,
yeah.
we can't hear you very well.
Well, I'm sorry about that. My speaker's up full. Can you hear now? Okay,
It,
I'll try.
it hasn't improved.
I'll try to speak up, but otherwise you'll have to turn up your speaker. So I was inspired by this book to write the not the sequel, but the alternative scenario, which is how do we get rid of these weapons, and where Annie Jacobsen used the second by second, minute by minute, blow by blow of what happens in a nuclear war. I have chosen to use the Doomsday Clock, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, and you move that clock backwards from the 89 seconds to midnight, where it is right now, the closest it's ever been in the history of the atomic age, to where it needs to be, many, many hours away from there. And my goal in writing this book was to demonstrate that it is totally possible, totally doable, totally manageable to eliminate nuclear weapons completely from the face of the earth. We've done it with other weapons. We can do it with nuclear weapons. And it's not naive to think that we can. It's naive to think that we can go on living with nuclear weapons without the kind of disaster that's described in Annie Jacobsen's book. So, and with people like Trump and Putin and Kim Jong-un and Netanyahu in charge of these weapons, so what could possibly go wrong? So I've used the clock to demonstrate steps, some of them very, very small steps, but they're all steps that will lead us in the direction of total abolition. And so I know that many of you have been working on this for years, and it's not easy. My second goal in writing this book is to encourage people who've been working on this, sometimes for decades, sometimes in the case of Setsuko Thurlow, the Hiroshima survivor, who's now in her 90s. You know, she's been working on it her entire life, and we're not there yet. But my book doesn't start today or tomorrow. The book is a continuation of all these efforts that have gone into not arms control, not non-proliferation, not this or that minimal step, but towards abolition of nuclear weapons. And I hope you will find it convincing. If not, if you've read the book, and that is, and you're still not convinced, I'm really happy to talk to you further about that. But Annie Jacobsen, for her book, interviewed all these generals and Pentagon officials and people involved in the nuclear enterprise. I interviewed activists, and including some of the people here on this call tonight. Some of them are quite extraordinary people, and some of them are very ordinary people. But I wanted to give an example of some of the steps that have been taken already, and what steps are underway, and more steps that could still be taken. And so I want to start with my friend Abdul Fatoma from Sierra Leone. He's on the right in this picture with some of his colleagues from the organization in Sierra Leone that is working on nuclear abolition. And he's there with the man in the center, Mujaba, who is a very influential politician in Sierra Leone and throughout West Africa. Abdul and his colleagues met with this gentleman, met with other senior politicians, got introduced to the foreign minister, through him got introduced to the president of Sierra Leone, and they got Sierra Leone to sign the nuclear ban treaty, the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And from there, Abdul has now already started working to get the next country on board, Guinea. So in my book, Guinea is the next country that signs the nuclear ban treaty. It might not be Guinea. It might be any number of other countries. So far, 73 countries have signed, have ratified this treaty, but bring it into law in those countries. Another 25 countries have signed and are in the process of ratifying the treaty. Another 40 countries have voted at the United Nations year after year in favor of this treaty, but haven't signed it themselves yet. And another 13 countries have been abstaining on the vote. They can't bring themselves to vote in favor of it yet, but these are all coming. All these different steps are on their way. And in the book, I talk about Australia. So this is Anthony Albanese. He's not one of the campaigners that I interviewed, but he is an important person in Australia. He's here at a ICANN Australia demonstration. ICANN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which won the Nobel Peace Prize for the Nuclear Ban Treaty, was started in Australia and is very strong there. And they worked for years to get the Australian Labor Party to support signing the ban treaty. And they went from local branches to regional structures to provincial structures and up to the National Labor Party convention, or whatever it's called, and got them to agree that Australia must sign the nuclear ban treaty. The Labor Party was not in power at that time. Since then, there have been elections. The Labor Party got in. Anthony Albanese, who's in this picture, is now the Prime Minister of Australia. He personally worked to get the Labor Party to support the ban treaty, and he's just been re-elected for his second term as Prime Minister. And we are very confident that sooner or later, Australia will, first of all, vote in favor of this treaty. That's the first little step they can take. Secondly, to sign it. And thirdly, to ratify it. And then there are more and more steps beyond that, which are in my book. So that's the kind of structure that the book has. I'll just give you a picture of the overall world picture of this treaty, which is a hugely important treaty that people still are not fully understanding the importance of. But in this map's a little bit out of date already because these things keep changing. But the blue countries have already ratified the treaty. The green ones are in the process of doing so. The yellow ones are the ones I was mentioning that have been voting for the treaty but not yet signed it themselves. And the orange ones are the ones like Australia, which I mentioned, which have been opposed to this treaty because they're strong allies of the United States. But sooner or later, these countries are going to join the treaty. And that's the hope in the book, is that we have already mechanisms going on in all these countries that will lead to this process. And so those are the protagonists in the book are all these activists that I've interviewed, and many that I haven't, who are working away in all these different countries and in the US, which I'll get to. But the antagonists are these companies. There's about 20 of them. They manufacture, develop, maintain nuclear weapons, not just for the United States, but some of them for France and the UK, and even some for India and China and Russia. But these private companies have enormous power over the nuclear weapons policy, especially of the United States. And until these companies are convinced that their days of nuclear weapons are up, these companies are the ones that are preventing further progress being made on the nuclear weapons front. And so these are our targets. And for example, in Australia, let me just see here. Where's my next slide? There. So Australia happens to host the largest operations of Boeing outside of the United States. And there's one piece of every Boeing 787 Dreammaker that is made in Australia and nowhere else. And so Australia is a key piece of the puzzle in terms of the Boeing's global operations. And these companies all operate all over the world. So they are going to be affected by this new treaty and the countries that join it. In the case of Australia, The question for Boeing is when Australia signs and ratifies and implements this treaty, which includes the requirement, the prohibition to have anything to do with nuclear weapons, including assisting with nuclear weapons, what will that mean for Boeing's operations in Australia? Even more to the point, what happens in a country like Ireland? Ireland is one of the countries most committed to the nuclear ban treaty, and they've already passed a law which prohibits anyone in Ireland having anything to do with nuclear weapons. And the penalty, as you can see on this slide, is a fine or imprisonment for life. And that is the kind of penalty which puts a real damper on companies that are involved in the nuclear weapons business. And as an example, we have this little cartoon. The countries not only host many of the companies that I just listed, but these countries have suppliers of these companies, they have subsidiaries, they have customers, they have investors. And this is where the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons really has the power to bring down the nuclear weapons industry and thereby the nuclear weapons themselves. And Switzerland, which hasn't even joined the nuclear ban treaty as yet, already prohibits financing of these companies. And this again is a very, very important tool, which we'll come back to when we start talking about the United States. But these are tools that the treaty offers these countries that are already building the pressure on these companies that make nuclear weapons and control the nuclear weapons policy of the United States. So to move on to the United States, there are, there are so many different ways that people in the United States can contribute to this global effort to put pressure on the companies. And I look at a few different examples, starting with very little steps that can be taken. For instance, joining Mayors for Peace. Mayors for Peace is a commitment to the elimination of nuclear weapons. It's not a very strong one, but it means that city is making that statement, and that puts notice on these companies. Back from the Brink and other campaigns passing resolutions that again call on the US to sign the treaty or to support the treaty or whatever. These are all steps that can be taken to put the companies under pressure. And the more we can do that, the more we can build those pressures that are already going on, the more we can get these companies to back away from their commitment to nuclear weapons, because these companies do not exist to make nuclear weapons. They exist to make a profit for their shareholders. And if that is in question or under threat, they will move out of the nuclear weapons business faster than Trump will change his tariff policy. I mean, these companies, do not want to lose business and public favor by being involved in business that nobody wants. And we know from the history, which again I look at in my book, the history from the 1980s and other periods where there have been enormous pressures put on some of these companies. And I use the example of General Electric, for example, which had hospitals and cities withdrawing contracts, millions of dollars worth, and divesting and so on, and put those companies under great threat. And many of them pulled out of the nuclear weapons industry. And it was not the only factor by any means, but it was certainly one of the factors which helped the Reagan administration reverse direction and move towards disarmament. And we can do that again. This is New York City, which did pass a divestment resolution to divest their $250 billion worth of pension funds from the nuclear weapons business. They haven't done so yet, but they're part of this process, and a very big one. Coming along very soon is Philadelphia, which has a very similar commitment that's being voted on soon. And these are the kinds of things that can really make a difference with these companies. In the case of Massachusetts, I don't know, you probably can't read this, but this is a law passed by the Massachusetts State House and signed by the governor that allows the city of Northampton to refuse bidders from to refuse to disqualify nuclear weapons companies from bidding for city contracts, which is a huge thing. Other cities have this already: Oakland, California, Tacoma Park, Maryland, and so on, Spokane, Washington. But this is an important step again in the process of moving to greater and greater steps that can really put the pressure on these companies. And we also have in Massachusetts a great effort. I'm very excited about this, not only because I live in Massachusetts, but because we have such an interesting coalition of groups coming from anti-genocide groups and young people and people that have never campaigned before on this kind of issue, all coming together to work on divestment of the state pension fund from the nuclear weapons companies and from other weapons of mass destruction. So we have all these steps being taken. They're not all successful yet, but that's part of the process of building this growing movement that puts pressure on the companies and ultimately gets the companies in my scenario. And my scenario is not the only scenario. I don't claim to be predicting what will happen, just one possible scenario of how we can use this treaty and the pressure that we can put on these companies and their vulnerability to that kind of pressure to put real change in the political sphere and to get the United States to agree to join the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is our only mechanism right now for elimination of nuclear weapons. And once we get the United States on board, then of course the question, well, what about the other 8 nuclear countries, which I do address in the book. So before you ask me lots of questions, have a look there. But in England, for example, in the UK, not many people know, even in the UK, that their nuclear weapons, their supposed so-called independent nuclear deterrent, is entirely dependent on US missiles. I mean, they actually rent their missiles. They put UK warheads on US missiles that have been rented from the United States, and they can't function without the United States. So once the US is committed to nuclear abolition, the UK is going to follow. France is committed to very close collaboration with the UK, so they're next. And I go through all the different countries. Obviously, when it comes to countries like Russia, it's going to be more complicated. There's lots of things that need to be done to make the world more fair and more safe for everybody, and especially in Europe, to really resolve not just the Ukraine war, but the overall security situation in Europe. But that's all doable. We've done these things before. We know how to do them. We've had agreements before. You know, this administration is not very prone to collaboration with other countries, but nevertheless, these things can be done. And as I said, my book doesn't predict when, but they're all steps that are being taken, and they build up to the point where we can actually eliminate these weapons. And this, I don't know if you can see what this picture is, but this is an example of the final stages of a disarmament treaty. I mean, this was the New START treaty when the US and Russia agreed to eliminate a whole bunch of planes as well as missiles and warheads. And what they did was they chopped them all up into pieces and spread them out on a field so that the other country could see by satellite that they had done it. And you know, these are the kinds of verification and monitoring systems that we already have well established for implementing and making sure that countries don't cheat and don't rebuild their nuclear arsenals. We have so many ways of monitoring and verifying that. And this is my favorite statue outside of the United Nations. I don't know how many of you have seen it, but it's called Good Defeats Evil or something like that. But if you can see, it's made out of nuclear missiles from the United States and the Soviet Union. So the sculptor got missiles that were destroyed under the INF Treaty and turned them into a sculpture. And that's our example of what's possible and what we've got to be doing. So the book is really about all these different steps and how they are, it gives an example in each case of what's already happened, and it gives a prediction or an idea of what could be the next country or the next city or the next entity to take this step, and then what would be the prize if we really got moving and could do more and more of this. So that's a very quick overview. I want to leave time for questions. This is a book club organized by World Beyond War. So if you want to have a much longer discussion about the book, you can sign up with World Beyond War or click on this QR code. This is going to be 4 weeks in October. It costs money, but you get a free book with it. And if you don't want to do the book club, but you want to get a book, you can also click on this, or I think Ed was going to put it in the chat, the link to buy the book. I mean, you can get it from any bookshop or library if you just ask for it. It's available through all the online shopping sites as well, but I'm not going to promote those because we don't like them all. But this is where it's currently out in hardback only, so it's a bit expensive, but it is coming out in paperback on September 1st. So if you want to wait and get it then, you're of course able to do that. So that is the end of my slides, but not the end of my presentation, because what I want to do next is encourage everybody, before we go into questions and discussion, I want to urge everybody to think about how they could contribute to this effort. And as I said, the book mostly, in terms of the United States, the book mostly focuses on cities and states and counties, because these have the biggest chance of putting pressure on the companies. But to get cities and states to do that, we also need many, many other entities to divest, to boycott, to shame these companies. So, for example, faith communities divesting, hospitals refusing to buy equipment from some of these companies. I mean, these companies make nuclear weapons, they make other weapons, but they also make all kinds of other things, mostly for large institutions like cities and states and hospitals and schools. But some of them, like Honeywell, makes products for individuals you can boycott. We're hoping we can help build some tools to help people know what they can boycott and what they can divest and so on. There are tools out there that you can look into. Susan mentioned the Warheads to Windmills campaign, which we're trying to promote all these tools and get people to do divestment. We've had some webinars about city divestment so far. But faith communities took the lead in the 1980s and really made a huge difference through their divestment campaigns. As you know, with the fossil fuel movement, fossil fuel divestment, it's been colleges and universities that have also made a big difference. Philanthropic organizations, all kinds of institutions can make a difference. So in the chat, is it already there, Edwin? Okay, so in the chat, if you would all please go just for a few minutes, we'll give you like 3 minutes to have a look, but go click on that link, go to the form, and think about one thing that you could work on, whether it's your faith community, your peace group, your bank, your city or town. There's divestment to think about. There's boycotting and getting cities to refuse contracts with these companies and that kind of thing. But there's also all kinds of ways that we can shame and stigmatize the companies through social media, through protests at their sites and so on, by shareholder actions. There's lots of different ways to do it. And we know these companies are vulnerable. And we know that, there may be other ways to get rid of nuclear weapons, but this is one way that has worked in the past to really put pressure on these companies and on many other issues like apartheid in South Africa and so on. And that is the strategy that's in the book. So please go to that link and see if you can think of things that you can do, and then we'll come back in a few minutes and we'll take questions. Okay, thanks.
I just wanted to say, for me, it's hard.
I want everybody to use the form, and then we'll come back to questions. You need to put your question in the chat, and then we'll take questions that way. Thanks. And while you're doing that, if you've got questions that you want to put in the chat, we'll be taking those next.
Hi, everyone. While you wrap up your forms, and feel free to think about that and fill it out whenever you have the link, you can save the link. I just want to introduce myself really quickly. I'll be handling the Q&A. I'm Anduin DeVos. I'm with the Where It's Windmills Coalition I'm based out of Northampton, Massachusetts. I said in the chat, but put your questions in the chat. If there's questions that you are really interested in, or if they're similar to yours, feel free to emphasize them so we make sure that I see them and I'm not maybe repeating myself so much. I want to start with a question that was from the beginning of the program. Judith Klein, I believe, asked about efforts that are being made to get discussions by nuclear disarmament advocates into public-facing programs like radio shows and talk shows. And I know you've done some of that, Tim, so maybe if you want to speak to those kinds of efforts and how we can expand that.
Yeah, I mean, this is, we try, everybody on this call, I'm sure, is trying every day to get on radio shows and podcasts and letters to the editor, and we're all working on that. But the reason, I have a whole chapter in the book about these companies, and not only do these companies have a huge influence on Congress and what Congress is willing to even talk about these weapons, but they have enormous influence over all the media, the academic conversations, the think tank conversations. It's very, very difficult to get out there when there's so much control over what's allowed to be talked about. And of course, there's also a lot of money involved in trying to promote these things. Buying an ad in the newspaper is very expensive. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I mean, there are certainly, small independent radio programs that are happy to, have people on. And, I just did one last weekend on Sirius XM. And there are others, as I said, I'm sure other people can also contribute to that.
Great. Yeah, I know you do a lot of work on that, and other activists are always trying to get more public facing. So it's definitely something that we just need to keep pushing on. There was a question from Patrick Bossold in the chat about your Trump card epilogue in the book. And maybe if you want to speak to maybe the likelihood of that, or what possible ways we could push to make that more likely. He was asking about maybe a Warheads to Windmills delegation heading to the White House. If you want to speak to that.
Okay, well, thanks for reading as far as the epilogue. That's great news. I have a prologue and an epilogue about Trump and how that has affected everything in the book. Because in the prologue side, it's actually Trump's coming back to the White House has meant that in Europe, especially, the opposition that's creating among citizens to the growing militarization, all the talk about a Eurobomb, all these things are I think going to help build a peace movement like there was in the 1980s. I mean, the 1980s peace movement in Europe exploded almost overnight because of the NATO decision, basically the US decision to put nuclear weapons in Europe in 1979. And by 1980, every single country in Europe was exploding with peace movement activity. And I think that that's, again, possible. It's not definite, but there's already signs of that happening. We've already seen the Trump effect in terms of the elections in Australia and in Canada, pushing people to vote for more progressive parties, because they don't want what we're doing here. So there's that. And then in the epilogue, I talk about the other option, which is that Trump himself has talked about denuclearization. He's talked about, these weapons are useless. We can't use them. They're too expensive. We're trying to cut money. So, I personally don't think that that's very likely. I mean, he says all kinds of things, but, you have to go by what he does more than what he says. And what he's doing so far is massive increase in the nuclear weapons program in the budget that he's just presented for next year, for example. There's no sign yet that he's doing anything remotely like what he could do in my epilogue. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't push him in that direction. And if any of you watched the special order hour in Congress, which was just a few moments before this started, you'll know that Jim McGovern, the representative from Western Massachusetts, was urging his Republican colleagues and the president to do what he says they're going to do, and I think we should all be pushing them on that. They talk about denuclearization and saving money and all the rest of it, so let's take them at that word. As for a delegation to the White House, pretty unlikely, but we can always try.
Great. I think the next, what flows most smoothly next is I see a lot of questions in the chat about how and what we can ask our members of Congress to do. And you're kind of touching on this now. I also see a lot of discussion mentioning the special orders and the different speeches. And we've been talking about how the problem is they're not talking about it, and their money is coming from a lot of these companies. So if you want to address maybe how we get the reps that we do get on board and how we keep pushing them, maybe just what that process looks like and what everyone else can do to get involved.
Sure. Well, as I said, the book is really about the companies, and as a strategy, it's very, very critical of putting all our eggs in the basket of trying to get elected officials to do anything about this. They're not going to, and we have support in Congress, but we're talking about a few people, literally a few. I mean, there's 12 people supporting the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in Congress right now. There's a few more supporting the Back from the Brink resolution, but I mean, that's a non-binding resolution. It doesn't commit them to doing anything. So the support is very, very weak in Congress, and it's going to take a long time. It's already taken us 7 years to get to this point. It took us a year to get Jim McGovern, who's now one of our champions. But it takes a lot of work. It needs to come from constituents. It needs to have conversations about the need to really take this issue more seriously. And there's all kinds of factors going on right now, obviously, with the Trump administration, with the Epstein files and all the rest of it. We had a meeting a couple of weeks ago with the members of the Progressive Caucus in Washington. There's 100 members of Congress who are in the Progressive Caucus, but of course they canceled the votes for that week because they'd stayed up all night doing the big ugly bill, and so they all left. And so we had staff. We didn't have any members of Congress at that meeting. Similar thing just happened today when they were supposed to be leaving tomorrow for their holiday for August recession. No, not recess. And but they, because of Epstein, they canceled the votes for tomorrow, and so they all left today. So we had 6 people who wanted to talk about nuclear weapons. Now, those are some of the best people we got in Congress, but that's only 6 out of 535. It's not anywhere near enough. And we got to keep pushing at them and keep having the conversations. But we've also got to be realistic that we're not going to get what we need from Congress, not now and not anytime in the near future. We need to put pressure on the companies. They have influence on Congress. They are the ones that can talk to the reps anytime they want to, and be listened to and taken seriously. And they have the influence on the think tanks and the other actors who are in Congress all the time, writing reports and so on. We've got to get at these companies, and we can. And that is the message that I'm trying to get across with my book. It's not to talk about trying to pass resolutions and get more members of Congress on board. It's about putting pressure, real pressure on these companies. We can do it. It's been done before with many, many other campaigns. And it's happening right now with fossil fuels. I mean, people don't realize we're not getting where we need to with the climate crisis, but we would be nowhere near where we are now if it weren't for the trillions of dollars that are being withheld from these companies because of divestment campaigns. And that's the kind of thing we got to be doing. How many
Great.
more?
Thank you for explaining that strategy a little bit more. On speaking about the climate crisis, I see a lot of questions in the chat as well about the links with what we're talking about here about nuclear weapons abolition with nuclear energy and how we can combine those in campaigning, but also in how we can use similar strategies that we're talking about here for nuclear weapons in fossil fuel and environmental campaigning. If you want to talk about how we can build that and how we can advocate for that together and what the connections are really.
Yeah, well, all these issues are connected, obviously, for the same reasons that are in the book, which are that it's the companies, it's the fossil fuel companies that are stopping Congress and the administration from from doing what they need to do about climate. And it's the nuclear weapons companies that are stopping them from doing what we need to do about nuclear weapons. And it's the pharmaceutical companies and the insurance companies that are stopping them from doing what we need to do about medical care and so on. I mean, it's all to do with these companies. And of course, the companies themselves are owned by these big asset firms like BlackRock and Vanguard and so on. And so we have to go after these companies and their financial backers, the investors, and so on. And we are trying to work together with climate groups on this very thing with the Warheads to Windmills Coalition. We have 70 national, state, and local organizations in our Warheads to Windmills National Coalition, and we're working together in Congress as well as trying to work on divestment campaigns and other efforts. But we can certainly do a lot more to collaborate and bring these issues together. Same with the Gaza issue. I mean, the companies that are sending weapons or supporting Israel in their assault on Gaza and the West Bank are a lot the same companies. I mean, it's not only the same weapons companies like Raytheon and General Dynamics and Boeing and so on, but even the same fossil fuel companies like Chevron and Shell and so on. So we have a lot of common ground to work together on. I forget what the rest of that question consisted of, but
I think that covers most of it. Yeah, there's certainly a lot to connect. Did you talk about the nuclear energy connection? Sorry.
right.
I was answering another question.
Okay, so nuclear energy, yeah. So again, it's a little bit more complicated identifying the companies involved because there's public utilities, there's energy agencies that have a lot of control and so on. But nuclear power is part of the problem. And we are, as the coalition, the Warheads to Windmills Coalition, we're committed to opposing nuclear power as a solution to climate or as any solution to anything. I mean, nuclear waste is generated from power plants and from weapons manufacture, as is the whole nuclear fuel cycle with the mining of uranium. I mean, all of that, the waste products and the environmental devastation is all the same, and it's unsustainable. And whether it's these small modular reactors or whatever, they're producing high-level nuclear waste that we don't know what to do with, and it's going to stay radioactive and dangerous for generations, and we don't know what to do with it. That's not a sensible strategy. So yeah, we're working on that too, and we're in common cause. My book is about nuclear weapons, so that's the focus of that.
Okay. I see a couple questions asking about specifically about divestment and boycotting efforts. One, how to find, and resources related to those. One, how to find a list of what to boycott comprehensively for these companies that we're talking about. And then also how to find out about what investments municipalities and other institutions have in these companies. And I know that's a lot of work that we've worked on. So if you want to share some of that, I think especially about the process of finding out about investments in municipalities can be helpful.
Yeah. So, I mean, in our case in Northampton, Massachusetts, we got a commitment from the city to divest from the nuclear weapons companies, and we simply asked the city treasurer what they have investments in, and they told us. And it was a small amount, but they agreed to get rid of them. In other cases, I mean, in the case of Massachusetts State Pension Fund, for example, we've been able to find out by putting in freedom of information requests to the board that manages the pension funds to find out some of the companies that they invest in. But a lot of these investment boards and municipalities or so on are very secretive about what they invest in. I mean, and they have people that handle that, and they don't want to talk about it. And so, part of some of the bills that are put out there have to do with transparency and trying to make these things public, because they're not, and we don't know what they're invested in. You can be pretty sure that any city or pension fund does have investments in the nuclear weapons companies, because companies like Boeing are not blue collar, what's the word? Blue something rather. Blue chip companies that they all have investments in, because they're considered, safe, secure investments. I mean, which is kind of surprising with Boeing, because it's going down along with many of its planes. But anyway, yeah, it takes work. All these things take work. There are websites with information. We try to collect some of it on our Warheads to Windmills website and the nuclearban.us. But there's an international website called Don't Bank on the Bomb, which is where we get most of our information. Maybe Edwin can put that in the chat. It's don'tbankonthebomb.com, which has a lot of information about the nuclear weapons companies specifically. AFSC.org, I think it is, has a lot of information about weapons companies and other companies doing business with Israel right now. There are other sites, fossil-free finance and so on, that have information about fossil fuel investments. And but it's work in progress. We don't have all the information. We don't have the resources to do this comprehensively. We're applying for funding to get help with that, but we need more activists and campaigners working on this, and not putting all their energy into trying to get a non-binding resolution passed, because that's easy. We can do that. We need more help to get these divestment things going and get the information and do the research and all the rest of it.
Great. I put a bunch of those links that you're mentioning in the chat. I hope they can be of help to people. We do have time for a couple more questions. I do see, just for fairness, I see someone who's here on the phone who has their hand raised. Obviously, they can't put their question in the chat. I do want to give them a quick opportunity. If they are available.
Hello.
Hi.
You kind of answered my question. How do you go about divesting? I mean, how do you recognize which investment funds have money invested in nuclear weapons, companies that are making nuclear weapons and so forth? And how do you go about doing it? What's the mechanism?
Great, thank you.
Yeah, well, in addition to the sources that Andrew just put in the chat, I don't know, maybe you don't have access to the chat either, but we are going to follow up this webinar with more divestment workshops and webinars and so on. There is a webinar online on our website, or can you put a link to the city one? Because we had examples from cities that have divested or committed to divesting. We had people talking about how they did it and what steps they took, and we had other people that are providing the resources. I mentioned AFSC and Don't Bank on the Bomb. There are other. Code Pink has a lot of resources. World Beyond War has resources. I think Veterans for Peace might have resources on this. So there are groups. We're trying to work together, but we're still getting there. But there are resources out there. There was an excellent resource that's no longer kept up to date from the Future of Life Institute, which where you could just put in your pension, pension portfolio, whatever, and it would tell you which bad companies you're invested in. And there are tools for boycotting as well. That was one of the questions earlier. There's an app called Boycat that you can get, which doesn't at the moment have nuclear weapons on it, but it does have other things that people are trying to boycott, and you can scan products in the supermarket or in a shop and get and it will tell you whether it's on the boycott list or not. As I said, I mentioned Honeywell. I mean, we have had maintained a list of products to boycott from Honeywell, but the problem with them is they keep selling off their bits of their company. So for instance, Honeywell thermostats, which we started a campaign to boycott because everybody has Honeywell thermostats. Well, they don't make the thermostats anymore. They're still called Honeywell, but they're not made by Honeywell. They're made by a separate company, so it gets complicated. But we are aiming to provide these kind of resources for people who want to do divestment. So put it in on that form that you're interested. Give us your email address. We'll try to keep you posted and up to date on ways that you can help with that. And then we should finish.
I see a few people. Okay, I'll take maybe two more. I want to have a question at the end. But I see a question that a few people are interested in about what it would actually take to motivate a company that's producing nuclear weapons to manufacture something else. I think you've been partially answering that. This whole process is about that. But if there's anything specifically you wanted to say to that, or the ask was also about like how do you approach those companies? So maybe you could share what you've done in the past, because we have met with those companies before.
Yeah, we've tried to. Vicky, my wife, has bought shares in some of these companies and gone to their shareholder meetings and talked directly to the CEOs and so on. We've written letters to, for instance, the CEO of Honeywell. We had hundreds of people all over the country writing to this guy, and he started answering. I mean, not him, but one of his vice presidents. And we've had correspondence with some of these companies. We know what their arguments are and so on. But just to give you an example, one of the companies on the list until a couple of years ago on the nuclear weapons production list was a company called Serco, SERCO. You can look it up. It's a British company. They were involved in making nuclear weapons for the UK. And their shareholders rose up and said, we're getting all these letters and complaints and people divesting from us from this company, and we don't want that. We want to get out of the nuclear weapons business. And they told the CEO of Serco not to continue with their contracts, so they didn't. So that's an example of how this can happen. I mean, this is what was happening in the 1980s with companies like Ford Motor Company, DuPont, General Electric, Westinghouse. All these companies were heavily invested in the nuclear weapons business, and they pulled out because of all this boycott and divestment, which they didn't like. They don't like it. These companies want to be seen as doing the right thing. They want to be patriotic. They want to be on the good side. And the more we can pester them and pull the rug out from under them, the more they are rethinking that. And it doesn't have to be all encompassing, because it's the threat that matters. It's the fact that every city that does something, or every country that joins the treaty, this is a trend, it's a direction, and these companies are looking ahead and they're like, wait a minute, this is not going our way, this is not looking good. We got to do something before it gets worse. So anyway, what's your last question?
Great. Yeah, we do have to wrap it up. I do see people are heading out, and we'll pass it over to Susan. But I did want to ask, I know you interviewed so many activists for this around the world, and I wanted to ask if there was one, or what was your favorite or most interesting thing you learned? I know you know a lot about this stuff already, but you were doing a lot of these interviews, so I just wanted to see what was something that stood out to you. It's most interesting or exciting.
Well, that's a great question. It was pretty exciting interviewing people, from South Africa, from Sierra Leone, from Australia, from India, from Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, Ireland, South Africa, did I say already? Yeah, I mean, they were all great people, and I learned from all of them, in terms of what stood out. I mean, I must say, I mentioned Australia, and I'm pretty excited about Australia for a number of reasons. One is that the person that I talked to, Jem, is a great campaigner, and they're doing great stuff. I mentioned that ICANN was founded in Australia, so they've got this whole history. Some of the great campaigners from ICANN come from Australia that are working internationally. But we've also just hired as our new ICANN executive director, Melissa Park, who used to be in the Parliament of Australia. She used to be the Minister for International Development in Australia. So so I learned a lot about, and New Zealand I also had a great conversation with. So anyway, I don't know how to answer that question, but yeah, lots of
Maybe
great.
people can read the book to find the interesting information.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm sorry we can't get to all the questions. There's some great ones in the chat. Feel free to reach out to us if we didn't answer them. And there's also some great conversation and ideas about campaigning in the chat as well. So
So put their email address in the chat. We'll get back to you if you haven't had your question answered.
or fill it out in the form. We'll get back to you that way as well. Either one. And with that, I'll hand it over to Susan for some closing remarks.
Okay, thank you so much, Timmon and Anduin, for a fascinating and important discussion. And thank you for all of your questions. And we keep on acting and figuring out ways to address these issues. I just wanted to bring attention to, as we wind down, going back to what we started out with, a mention of the 80th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And as one of the Congress people mentioned today, that was an event. It was not singular. That is still happening with the testing, the mining, the milling, the effects on people in this country and elsewhere. But here in Massachusetts, if you're around, if you live in Massachusetts, there are events going on all over the state. We are hoping to have a big event here in Boston on the 6th at Dewey Square in Boston. And if you're around and you would like to come, your organization wants to have a table, please let us know and send that information to Owen at masspeaceaction.org. That's Owen at masspeaceaction.org. And to all of you outside of Massachusetts, whatever events you are having to talk about this moment, about this 80th anniversary, and the ongoing work that we need to do. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. And keep in touch and keep on acting.